My name is Mallory. I'm 28 years old, and the last thing I remember before the ocean swallowed me whole was my stepmother's smile. Cold water closed over my head, salt burning my lungs as I sank deeper into the darkness. The shock of betrayal hit harder than the Pacific ever could. Above me, through the churning surface, I could see their silhouettes on the yacht deck, 3 shadows against the moonlight, not moving, not helping, just watching. My father stood among them. The weight of my soaked clothes dragged me down like anchors tied to my ankles. My mind screamed the truth. It'd been too blind to see. They wanted my inheritance, all $6.5 billion of my father's tech empire that I'd signed over to the family trust just that morning. But as my vision started to blur, and my body begged for air, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. They made one fatal mistake. Before we dive into how I crawled back from the dead to destroy them, tell me where you're watching from right now. Drop your location in the comments because this story spans from California's coastline to federal courtrooms, and I want to know where my survivors are watching from. Hit that like button if you've ever felt betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, and subscribe because what happens next is going to show you exactly how the underestimated rise up and take back everything that was stolen. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment when I was still naive enough to believe that family meant something. I grew up as the only child of a man who built empires from code and determination. My father started his AI security company in our garage when I was just a baby, writing algorithms at 3 in the morning while my mother brought him coffee and believed in his vision. By the time I was 7, had grown the startup into a $50 million operation. But that was also the year I lost my mother to a car accident on the interstate. The drunk driver walked away without a scratch while my mom died on impact, and my father never really recovered from losing her. He threw himself into work even harder, and I threw myself into trying to make him proud, learning to code at 8 years old just so we'd have something to talk about at dinner. When I was 10, he remarried a woman named Vivian, a corporate lawyer with sharp cheekbones and sharper ambitions, who brought 2 children into our home. Garrett was 15 then, already resentful of his new stepfather's wealth, and Sloane was 9, just young enough to learn how to fake affection while plotting behind your back. For 18 years, I tried to make our blended family work because my father wanted it so desperately. Had lost my mother and couldn't bear the thought of a broken home, so he forced us all to smile for family photos, while tension simmered beneath every holiday dinner and birthday celebration. I excelled at Stanford, studying computer science, graduated top of my class, and came back to work at my father's company from the ground up because I refused to be called a nepotism hire. I started in quality assurance testing, worked my way through junior development, and spent 3 years in the trenches before my father even acknowledged my contributions in a board meeting. When I was 24, I developed a breakthrough encryption algorithm that revolutionized our security protocols, an innovation that solved problems our competitors had spent millions trying to crack. The algorithm became the backbone of our entire product line, and within 2 years, the company's valuation exploded from $500 million to $6.5 billion. I'd built the foundation of an empire, but my father still looked at me like I needed to prove myself, while Garrett got a vice president title for showing up to work 3 days a week, and Sloane burned through company funds on failed business ventures that my father funded. Without question, family dinners became battlegrounds, where Vivian would make passive-aggressive comments about me being spoiled, while her children drove company cars they didn't earn and lived in penthouses they didn't pay for. Garrett's incompetence was legendary in the office, making decisions that cost us clients and then blaming his team when projects failed. But my father refused to see it because Vivian had convinced him that criticizing Garrett would destroy our family unity. Sloane was worse in her own way, spreading rumors throughout the industry that I'd slept my way into my position, posting coded insults on social media that my father was too technologically illiterate to understand. I tried everything to bridge the gap between us. I offered to mentor Garrett, spending hours explaining systems he should have understood years ago, and he threw my help back in my face during a board meeting by suggesting I was undermining his authority. I took Sloane to lunch once a week for 6 months, trying to build a sisterhood, and she used every conversation to gather ammunition about my personal life that she'd later weaponize in company gossip. My father saw none of it because Vivian had perfected the art of playing devoted wife in his presence, while orchestrating a cold war behind his back. Then his heart condition started getting worse. The doctors called it early-onset cardiomyopathy, a genetic weakness that stress had accelerated. And suddenly my father was facing mortality at 62 years old, instead of the 90 he'd always assumed he'd reach. His lawyers advised setting up an irrevocable trust to protect the assets and ensure smooth succession. And after months of negotiations, the terms were finalized. I would receive 80% as the primary beneficiary, and the one who'd actually built the technology that made us billions, while Garrett and Sloane would each get 10%, and Vivian would receive a secured but smaller inheritance from my father's personal assets. I thought the unequal distribution would cause immediate conflict, but instead, they became suddenly, unnaturally agreeable. Vivian insisted we all take a family yacht trip to celebrate the trust signing, calling it one last perfect memory before my father's health declined further. He loved the idea, got teary, talking about how proud he was that his family was finally unified, and I ignored every screaming instinct that told me something was wrong because I wanted so desperately to believe that love could win. The red flags were everywhere if I'd been willing to see them. Vivian's too sweet insistence that every family member attend the yacht trip without exception, no work excuses accepted. Garrett's unusual friendliness in the weeks leading up to departure, actually complimenting my work in meetings for the first time in years. Sloane suddenly wanting to bond, asking me to go shopping for the trip together, taking selfies with me that she posted with captions about sisterhood. The yacht staff being mysteriously changed at the last minute. My father explaining that our regular crew had a scheduling conflict even though I knew they'd been booked for months. Every cell in my body screamed danger, but I'd spent 21 years trying to earn my family's acceptance, and I couldn't let go of the fantasy that maybe, finally, we could be real. So I packed my bags, signed the trust documents that morning at the lawyer's office, and boarded that yacht with a smile on my face and hope in my heart, completely unaware that I was boarding my own coffin. The yacht was a 70-footer, all gleaming white surfaces and teak wood decks, with a crew of 4 who avoided making eye contact whenever I tried to be friendly. We sailed out from Marina del Rey on a perfect California morning, the kind of weather that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen under such blue skies. The Pacific stretched out around us like liquid sapphire, and my father stood at the bow with his arms spread wide, breathing in the salt air like it could cure his failing heart. That first day felt almost magical in its normalcy. We had champagne with lunch, my father toasting to family and legacy, and the future wed all billed together. Vivian played the gracious hostess, making sure everyone's glass stayed full and steering conversation away from any topic that might cause tension. Garrett gave a speech about how he'd been jealous of my relationship with our father for years but wanted to change, wanted to be real siblings instead of competitors. And I actually believed him because I wanted to so badly. Sloane cried, hugged me tight enough that I could feel her heartbeat, and whispered that she was sorry for being cruel, that jealousy had made her a monster but she was ready to be better. Even Vivian seemed warm, touching my shoulder in a way that felt almost maternal, calling me her daughter instead of stepdaughter. I went to bed that night thinking that maybe near-death experiences changed people, that watching my father face mortality had finally shown them what mattered. The second day started with my father needing to rest because his heart was acting up, the medication making him drowsy and weak. Vivian suggested the kids have bonding time on deck while she stayed with him, and we agreed because it seemed thoughtful and generous. The afternoon sun was brutal, so we moved to the shaded aft deck where Garrett pulled out a bottle of expensive whiskey, the kind that cost more per ounce than most people made in an hour. He insisted we do shots to celebrate our new beginning as real family, pouring generous glasses and making elaborate toasts. My drink tasted slightly off, bitter in a way whiskey shouldn't be, but I dismissed it as paranoia because I was finally having fun with my siblings. We told childhood stories, laughing about memories I didn't even know they had, and for 3 perfect hours I felt like I belonged. Garrett suggested we start a midnight tradition, something just for us siblings, where we'd jump into the ocean at midnight and make wishes for our future together. It sounded silly and impulsive, and exactly like the kind of bonding experience I'd always craved. so I agreed immediately, already thinking about what I'd wish for. Midnight came with a full moon painting silver paths across the dark water. I changed into casual clothes, leaving my phone and jewelry in my cabin because Garrett said we'd only be in the water for a minute. They told me not to wear a life jacket because it would ruin the authenticity of the experience, and I was too buzzed on whiskey and belonging to question the logic. The crew had mysteriously disappeared below deck, and I noticed but didn't understand why that should worry me. We stood at the rail, the three of us in a row, and Garrett counted down from 3. I closed my eyes to make my wish, hoping with everything in me that this moment was real, that I finally had the family I'd always wanted. The wish forming in my mind was simple and desperate. Please let them really love me. I never got to finish the thought because suddenly hands were on me, Garrett gripping my arms with brutal strength while Sloane grabbed my legs, and they lifted me like I weighed nothing at all. My eyes flew open and I saw Vivian standing behind them, her face finally showing its true nature. No warmth, no maternal affection, just cold calculation and triumph. She leaned close enough that I could smell her perfume and said, "You were always in the way." They lifted me over the rail and I screamed for my father, my voice raw with betrayal and terror. He appeared on deck like a ghost, his face pale in the moonlight, and for one desperate second I thought, "Head, save me." Our eyes met and I saw something break in his expression, but his feet stayed planted. Vivian's voice cut through my screams. "The company needs stronger leadership, and you're too weak to provide it. This is better for everyone." Then they let go and I was falling, the ocean rushing up to meet me, and the last thing I heard before the water swallowed my scream was my father's voice saying, "I'm sorry, sweetheart," but Vivian made me understand. The ocean was so much colder than I expected, stealing the breath from my lungs instantly. My heavy clothes dragged me down like they were made of lead, and I fought against the weight while my mind reeled from what had just happened. My father knew. Head stood there and watched them throw me overboard and had done nothing except apologize like that made it better. The betrayal cut deeper than the cold water, deeper than the fear of drowning, and for a moment I almost let myself sink because what was the point of surviving if the person I loved most in the world had just murdered me? But then rage kicked in, hot and furious enough to burn through the shock. They thought I was weak, thought I'd just die quietly and let them steal everything I'd built. I kicked off my shoes and fought my way out of my jacket, my fingers clumsy with cold but determined. When I surfaced, gasping and choking on salt water, the yacht was already distant, its lights moving away without even slowing down to check if I'd drowned. They weren't even going to make sure I was dead. That's how little I mattered to them. I treaded water in the vast darkness, surrounded by nothing but ocean and sky, and forced my panicking brain to think. The Pacific was 58 degrees. Cold enough to kill me from hypothermia in a few hours, even if I didn't drown first. I was miles from shore with no life jacket and no one looking for me because my family wanted me dead. Logic said I should give up, that survival was impossible, but rage is a powerful fuel. I spotted a light in the distance, a flashing beacon that my desperate brain recognized as an emergency signal from another vessel or piece of maritime equipment. Swimming toward it seemed insane, but staying still meant certain death, so I swam. My arms burned and my legs cramped, and I swallowed so much salt water that my throat felt scraped raw. But I kept moving because every stroke was an act of defiance against the people who'd tried to erase me. 3 times I nearly gave up, my body begging to just slip under the surface and let the ocean have me. But each time I thought about their faces when they realized I'd survived, and that fantasy pulled me forward. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes, my hand hit something solid, a piece of floating debris from an old wreck, and attached to it was a functioning emergency beacon. I clung to that debris and activated the beacon, then waited in the freezing water for rescue, my mind already calculating revenge. The Coast Guard helicopter appeared like an angel of salvation, its spotlight turning night into day as they pulled me from the water. I was hypothermic, my core temperature dangerously low, but I was alive and conscious enough to lie convincingly. I told them I'd fallen overboard from a private yacht, that we'd gotten separated in the fog, that the captain was probably searching for me on the wrong side of the island. They bought every word, because they had no reason to suspect attempted murder. At the mainland hospital, I checked in under a false name using my mother's maiden name, Collins, and paid cash for a private room. I told the hospital staff I was a traumatized crew member whose captain had died in the accident, and they offered counseling without asking too many questions. While nurses fussed over my vitals and doctors worried about my lungs, I used the time to plan, because the old Mallory had drowned in that ocean. The woman who climbed out was someone new, someone harder, and she was going to make them all pay for their mistake. The hospital kept me for 5 days, while my body recovered from near drowning and hypothermia, but my mind was working faster than it ever had before. I'd hidden a backup phone in my luggage before the trip, an old habit from my tech security background, and I'd managed to grab it from my cabin before that midnight gathering because some paranoid instinct told me to keep it close. Now that phone became my lifeline to understanding exactly how deep this betrayal went. Through careful cloud access to my backup files, I discovered evidence that made my blood run cold. Email chains between Vivian and a forensic accountant spanning 8 months, meticulously mapping every asset, every account, every possible dollar of my inheritance. Meeting notes from Garrett with board members, conversations where he positioned himself as the mature successor ready to take over when the tragic happened. Text messages between Sloane and Vivian discussing how Sloane needed to befriend me, gain my trust, make absolutely certain I signed those trust documents before they made their move. But the worst discovery came in emails between my father and Vivian. Messages where he wrote, "I can't do this. She's my daughter," followed by Vivian's responses systematically breaking down his resistance, convincing him I was too weak to lead, that the company would fail under my control, that this was mercy rather than murder. The planning had taken 8 months of careful manipulation. Vivian had researched maritime law, consulted with lawyers under false pretenses about inheritance when primary beneficiaries die, even hired the replacement yacht crew through intermediaries so nothing could be traced back to her. The original plan had been to stage an accident where I drunkenly fell overboard, with the crew as witnesses to my intoxication and carelessness. But somewhere in the planning, they'd decided witnesses were liabilities, so they'd bribed the crew to disappear after the trip, paying the captain $200,000 to take his team to Mexico and stay silent. Every detail had been calculated, every contingency planned, except for one thing. They'd underestimated my will to survive, and that mistake was going to cost them everything. On the 3rd day of my hospital stay, local news stations broke the story. Tech heiress missing at sea, presumed dead, scrolled across every channel while I watched from my hospital bed with cold fascination. My father held a press conference, standing at a podium with Vivian beside him, her hand on his arm in a show of supportive devotion. He looked broken, his voice cracking as he talked about his precious daughter lost too soon, how it'd been the light of his life since my mother died. Vivian dabbed at her eyes with tissues, her performance worthy of an award. Garrett stood behind them in a black suit, his face arranged in appropriate grief, promising reporters that they'd honor my memory by continuing my work and ensuring the company thrived. Sloane posted a series of Instagram photos of us together, captions about her sister and hero taken too soon, and the comments flooded with sympathy from people who had no idea they were mourning someone who'd been murdered. The most horrifying part was watching the company's stock price actually rise on the news of my death. Investors apparently relieved that veteran leadership would be returning to guide the company forward. I watched that press conference 3 times, studying every fake tear and calculated word, feeling something inside me transform from hot rage into cold calculation. The old Mallory who desperately wanted their approval had died in the Pacific Ocean. The woman who survived was someone different, someone who understood that sentiment was weakness and revenge required patience. I realized I had advantages they couldn't possibly know about. I was alive when they thought I was dead, giving me the element of surprise. I still had access to company systems through backdoors ID built into my own encryption algorithm, access points that existed outside the standard security protocols because ID designed them as emergency measures. I knew every secret of the company's architecture because id built most of it. And most importantly, I knew exactly who they were now, while they still thought of me as the naive daughter, desperate for family love. That knowledge gap was a weapon, and I intended to use it without mercy. I discharged myself from the hospital after 5 days, against medical advice but with my body functional enough to move. Using cash and fake identification I'd acquired through some very expensive but very discreet contacts. I rented a small apartment in San Diego, far enough from Los Angeles to avoid accidental recognition, but close enough to monitor the situation. I dyed my hair dark brown, started wearing glasses with plain lenses, changed my style from designer clothes to generic basics, and became invisible, just another woman in a city of millions, completely unremarkable. I set up burner laptops in that apartment, routing everything through VPN layers I'd personally designed during my time developing security protocols, creating a digital fortress that even government agencies would struggle to penetrate. Then, I began the ghost work, accessing company systems remotely to document everything they were doing. They'd assumed my death would lock them out of my personal access, but they'd forgotten that I was the access, that the systems answered to me in ways no password reset could prevent. My salvation came in an encrypted message that appeared in my secret email account, one that only a handful of people even knew existed. The sender was Luther, my father's chief financial officer for 30 years, and the only board member who'd publicly questioned the circumstances of my death. His message was brief and careful. If you're alive, I'm here. They're looting the company. I spent 2 hours verifying his identity through coded questions that only the real Luther would understand. Questions about my mother and private conversations we'd had over the years. When I was finally certain it wasn't a trap, I arranged a meeting at an empty warehouse in an industrial area, arriving 2 hours early to make sure I wasn't walking into an ambush. Luther showed up exactly on time, alone as instructed, and when he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. Had been my mother's colleague before she married my father, had watched me grow up, and finding out I was alive seemed to break something in his careful composure. He handed me a folder of documents that confirmed my worst fears. Vivian had already started transferring assets to offshore accounts. Garrett was negotiating deals to sell off divisions of the company. My father was signing everything they put in front of him, guilt and grief making him compliant to Vivian's control. If I didn't act soon, there'd be nothing left to save. Luther became my eyes inside the company, feeding me real-time information about board meetings and financial transactions. In return, I started making small moves, strategic interference they couldn't trace, freezing accounts just long enough to delay their asset transfers, then unfreezing them before anyone could investigate, creating system glitches that prevented certain wire transfers from processing. Tiny acts of sabotage that they blamed on technical difficulties, never suspecting the ghost in their machine was the woman they'd murdered. I was more powerful dead than I'd ever been alive, because dead women don't have to follow rules or worry about consequences. For the first time in my life, I was free to be as ruthless as necessary, and that freedom was intoxicating. Every night, I went to sleep in that generic apartment, planning the next day's moves, and every morning I woke up feeling stronger, colder, more certain of exactly how I'd destroy them. They'd tried to drown me to steal my inheritance, but I was going to teach them that some things are far worse than drowning. 2 weeks after my supposed death, they held the memorial service at company headquarters, transforming our main auditorium into a shrine to my memory. I watched through hacked security cameras from my apartment, laptop balanced on my knees while rage threatened to crack my careful control. 500 people attended, filling every seat while overflow crowds gathered in adjacent rooms to watch on screens. Industry leaders flew in from around the world, competitors sent representatives, and the media covered it like a state funeral. Because it'd been Silicon Valley's golden child, the rare tech heiress who'd actually earned her position. My father delivered the eulogy from behind a podium, his voice breaking in what seemed like genuine grief, talking about how I'd inherited my mother's brilliance and his determination, how I'd been destined for greatness before the ocean stole me away. But I noticed his eyes stayed dry even when his voice cracked, and I noticed how Vivian's hand on his arm tightened whenever his words strayed too close to actual emotion. Garrett and Sloane stood on either side of him in matching black designer clothes, their faces arranged in appropriate mourning, accepting condolences from people who praised their strength and resilience during this difficult time. The formal will reading happened 3 days later in a lawyer's office downtown, and Luther attended as CFO to witness and report back to me. The trust terms were clear and devastating. Because Id died before my father, the primary beneficiary clause became void, activating the alternative distribution plan. Garrett would receive 45% of all assets. Sloane would get 45%. Vivian would receive 10% plus her widow's share of my father's personal assets once he died. My father retained control of the company until his death, but his children were now the legal heirs to an empire worth billions. Stock options, real estate portfolios, liquid assets totaling nearly $4 billion would be distributed among them, with another $2.5 billion in company assets remaining under my father's control until his eventual death. They'd actually won $6.5 billion total by throwing me off a yacht, and the legal system had handed it to them without question, because why would anyone suspect a family of murdering their own daughter? Their true colors emerged before the ink even dried on the distribution documents. By week 3, Garrett had fired 12 senior executives who'd been loyal to me, replacing them with his incompetent friends from business school, who'd failed upward through family connections and corporate politics. He made sweeping changes to product development, overriding decisions that teams had spent months perfecting, causing 3 major clients to walk away in frustration. Sloane celebrated her windfall by buying a $15 million mansion in Malibu with ocean views, posting Instagram photos of the infinity pool with captions about new beginnings and healing through self-care. The comments section filled with supportive messages from followers who praised her strength, completely unaware she was celebrating successfully murdering her stepsister. I sat in my San Diego apartment watching her tour the house in Instagram stories, pointing out the custom closet that would hold her designer shoe collection, and I had to physically restrain myself from throwing my laptop through the window. Luther reported that the family threw a private celebration at the estate 2 days after the will reading, a party for just the 4 of them and household staff who'd been sworn to secrecy. Vivian ordered cases of wine that cost $1,000 per bottle, and they gathered in the dining room to toast their success. Luther had convinced one of the servers to record the dinner on her phone by paying her $5,000 and promising protection. The audio he sent me was sickening, Garrett's voice slurring with expensive wine as he said, "Should have done this years ago, honestly. She was always so sanctimonious about earning her position." Sloane's laugh, high and cruel. I almost felt bad when we pushed her, watching her face realize what was happening. Almost. Vivian's response, cold and satisfied. She was always weak, just like her pathetic mother. Some people are born to lead, others are born to follow. Mallory couldn't tell the difference. And through it all, my father said nothing, just drank glass after glass of wine, while his new family celebrated murdering his daughter. That audio recording became my favorite thing to listen to whenever I felt any remaining sympathy for any of them. A reminder that mercy would be wasted on monsters. The business consequences of Garrett's incompetence showed up immediately. Within a month, Head made a catastrophically bad deal with a Chinese competitor, nearly giving away proprietary encryption technology in exchange for what he thought was a lucrative partnership but was actually a transparent attempt to steal our intellectual property. Only intervention from Luther and 2 other board members prevented complete disaster. But even their rescue couldn't stop the company's stock from dropping 8% as news of the near disaster leaked to industry insiders. Tech blogs started running pieces with headlines like "Empire Crumbling Without Its Architect" and questions mount about new leadership at security giant. Garrett responded to criticism by threatening to fire anyone who questioned his decisions, creating a culture of fear that drove away talented employees who had other options. The company I'd spent my entire adult life building was being destroyed in real time, and watching it happen from my apartment felt like dying all over again, slower and more painful than drowning could ever be. Sloane's wasteful spending accelerated beyond even my worst predictions. She bought 3 luxury cars in a single month, vehicles she'd drive once for Instagram photos, then leave collecting dust in her massive garage. She chartered private jets to Paris for weekend shopping trips, staying in hotel suites that cost $30,000 per night. She started dating a celebrity musician who was obviously using her for money and connections, and she funded his entire lifestyle, including studio time for an album no one would ever listen to. In just 30 days, Sloane burned through $18 million, like it was Monopoly money, and Vivian encouraged every purchase, telling her daughter she'd earned this luxury through her hard work and sacrifice. No one was teaching either of them that even billions run out eventually if you're determined enough to waste them, and watching their financial suicide in slow motion would have been satisfying if it wasn't destroying the company and legacy ID built. My father deteriorated rapidly under the weight of what had done. Luther reported that he drank heavily every night, expensive scotch from his study starting at noon and continuing until he passed out. His heart condition worsened from the alcohol and stress, and his doctor warned him that he had maybe 6 months left at his current pace. But Vivian didn't discourage the drinking, didn't push him toward treatment or healthier choices. Luther overheard her on the phone with her personal lawyer, asking about inheritance timelines and what happened to a widow's share if her husband died sooner than expected. She was literally waiting for my father to drink himself to death, counting days until she could fully liquidate everything and disappear with her children to live off blood money. Every report Luther sent me about my father's decline caused genuine pain, because despite everything, some stupid part of me still loved the man who'd taught me to code and told me I could change the world. I hated myself for that weakness, but I couldn't seem to kill it no matter how many times I replayed the memory of his face when he let them throw me overboard. Through careful monitoring and Luther's intelligence, a clear timeline emerged. They planned to fully liquidate the company within 2 years, selling to the highest bidder and walking away with billions in cash that they'd salt away in offshore accounts beyond the reach of American tax authorities. They didn't care about legacy, about the 3,000 employees whose livelihoods depended on the company, about the clients who trusted our security systems, or about anything except converting assets into liquid money they could spend on luxuries and excess. It was the most naked display of greed I'd ever witnessed, and I'd spent my entire adult life in Silicon Valley, where greed was practically a religion. Luther looked exhausted and defeated during our weekly meetings. This man Wad worked 30 years to build something meaningful, watching it circle the drain. He asked me every time when I'd make my move, when I'd reveal myself and stop the destruction. But I told him the same thing each week. Not yet. They needed to feel safe, needed to commit more crimes, needed to believe they'd gotten away with murder completely. And most importantly, they needed to destroy themselves just a little bit more before I delivered the final blow. Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet, and I intended to savor every moment of their destruction when it finally came. After 6 weeks of observation and documentation, my strategy crystallized into something elegant and brutal. Simply destroying them wouldn't be enough. Too quick and too merciful for what they'd done. They needed to destroy themselves, needed to feel the triumph of victory before I tore it away, needed to commit so many crimes in their arrogance that no lawyer or judge would ever show mercy. I would create the conditions for their downfall, then sit back and watch while their own greed became the weapon that ended them. The beauty of it was that they'd willing build their own prison cell brick by brick. And they'd do it with smiles on their faces because they'd think they were building a castle. The first move required creating a phantom buyer, a fictional company so perfectly constructed that even thorough investigation would find nothing suspicious. I spent 2 weeks building the identity of Arcturus Holdings, supposedly based in Singapore with vague but impressive connections to international investment funds. I created a complete digital footprint, including a professional website, listings in business directories, and carefully manufactured mentions in obscure financial publications. The company's representative, played by a professional actress I hired through a series of intermediaries that left no trail, reached out to Garrett expressing interest in acquiring my father's company for $7 billion, substantially above current market valuation. I knew Garrett would salivate at the offer, and I was right. He called an emergency board meeting within hours of receiving the inquiry, pushing hard for the company to seriously consider the acquisition, despite multiple board members expressing concern about selling during a time of transition. But Garrett had control now, and my father was too drunk and depressed to put up much resistance, especially when Vivian whispered in his ear about securing his children's financial future. As Arcturus Holdings, I demanded extensive due diligence before finalizing such a large acquisition, requiring them to compile and organize every financial record, every asset list, every account number and transaction history from the past 5 years. The request was standard for deals of this size, so they complied without suspicion, spending weeks organizing documentation that would eventually serve as evidence in their prosecution. Garrett personally compiled reports on all the questionable deals Head made since taking control, proud of his negotiating skills and eager to impress the potential buyers. Sloane provided detailed receipts of her spending, actually bragging about her ability to enjoy her wealth without guilt. Vivian handed over information about offshore accounts, trusts, and shell corporations, carefully organized in spreadsheets that showed exactly how they'd been moving money beyond the reach of tax authorities. They were building a complete case against themselves and gifting it to me with ribbons on top, never suspecting that the interested buyer was the woman they'd murdered. My second attack vector came from discovering an old secret buried in Garrett's past. Through some very expensive private investigators and even more expensive hackers, I learned that Head embezzled $600,000 from his previous employer before joining my father's company. Head covered his tracks well enough to avoid prosecution, but the evidence still existed if you knew where to look. I anonymously sent hints about this skeleton to Vivian, carefully worded suggestions that she could use this information to maintain control over Garrett if he ever became difficult or tried to cut her out of deals. Vivian took the bait exactly as predicted, gathering evidence and keeping it hidden for future leverage, not realizing that I was documenting her blackmail attempts. Now I had evidence of conspiracy to commit extortion on top of everything else, another charge to add to the growing list. The third strike targeted Sloane's increasingly chaotic personal life. Her celebrity musician boyfriend was scamming her in spectacular fashion, using her money to fund his lifestyle while maintaining a secret wife and family in Nevada. His wife, having finally discovered the affair and the money involved, hired a private investigator and a ruthless divorce attorney. I anonymously contacted that attorney and provided information about Sloane's assets and spending patterns, essentially pointing them toward a $50 million lawsuit target. When the wife filed suit, Sloane panicked and started frantically hiding money in increasingly desperate and illegal ways, creating new accounts, making suspicious transfers, and leaving a trail of financial crimes that were incredibly easy to document. She was too stupid and too panicked to do crime properly, and her amateur hour attempts at asset concealment became yet another gift to my growing prosecution file. The family stress started turning them against each other exactly as Id hoped. Garrett accused Sloane of spending too recklessly and potentially endangering the Arcturus deal if her financial chaos made the company look unstable. Sloane accused Garrett of sabotaging the company's value with his incompetence, making them all look bad to potential buyers. Vivian played both sides, gathering dirt on each of her children while pretending to mediate, building leverage over them for some future play I could only imagine. My father retreated further into his study and his scotch, barely participating in family or business matters anymore. Luther reported that they could barely tolerate being in the same room together, that board meetings had become hostile and unproductive, that the carefully maintained facade of family unity was cracking apart under the pressure of greed and paranoia. I watched it all happen through security cameras and Luther's reports, feeling like a director watching her masterpiece take shape. But my secret weapon was something they couldn't possibly have anticipated. When Id developed my encryption algorithm at age 24, Id built in a hidden backdoor that existed outside the normal security architecture. It wasn't illegal and it wasn't malicious, just a safety measure that would let me access systems if something catastrophic happened to the regular admin controls. Only I knew about this backdoor, and Id buried documentation about it in personal files that my supposed death had made inaccessible to everyone else. That backdoor gave me access to 80% of the company's security infrastructure, letting me see every email, every file transfer, every supposedly secure communication. They'd locked me out of my administrative accounts, but that didn't matter because I didn't need accounts. I was the system, built into the architecture at such a fundamental level that removing me would require rebuilding everything from scratch. I could see every secret, every lie, every crime they committed in real time, and they had no idea their murdered victim was watching everything. After 6 weeks of careful collection, my documentation was complete and devastating. I had audio proof of them celebrating my murder, video evidence of financial fraud, detailed records of Garrett's illegal deals and Sloane's tax evasion, proof of bribery in the yacht crew payments, insurance fraud from their claims on my death, money laundering through offshore accounts. emails explicitly planning my murder with detailed discussions of method and timing. Enough evidence to put them in prison for life multiple times over. Presented in formats so clear and organized that even the most overworked prosecutor could build an airtight case. It'd done their job for them, and it'd done it so thoroughly that no defense attorney would be able to create reasonable doubt. The resurrection plan came together with perfect timing. 3 months after they'd thrown me into the Pacific, I would return from the dead at the family estate, the same house where they'd celebrated my murder with $1,000 wine. The date mattered, symbolism was important, and I wanted them comfortable and confident when I appeared. I'd return as a ghost made flesh, standing in their home while FBI agents waited outside. Luther's role was to keep key board members and employees loyal, to prevent complete collapse while Garrett drove the company toward disaster, to protect enough core assets that something could be saved when I took back control. He played his part perfectly, the loyal soldier working 18-hour days to hold things together while pretending he believed I was really dead. I spent a week preparing myself physically and mentally for the confrontation. I bought an elegant black suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, got professionally styled at an exclusive salon, and practiced my entrance in the mirror until every gesture and word conveyed exactly the right mix of power and menace. The woman who looked back at me from that mirror was unrecognizable from the naive daughter Wad boarded that yacht 3 months earlier. This woman had drowned and been reborn harder, colder, absolutely ruthless in her pursuit of justice. I practiced keeping emotion out of my voice, speaking about my own murder like it was a business transaction rather than a trauma. This wasn't revenge driven by hot rage anymore. This was justice delivered with surgical precision, and I intended to enjoy every second of their destruction. The final piece fell into place when I sent an anonymous message to the family from Arcturus Holdings, suggesting that the deal was ready to finalize and requesting an in-person meeting at the estate for signing. All family members needed to attend, I insisted, because this was a momentous occasion that required everyone's presence. They agreed immediately, too blinded by dollar signs to question why a Singapore-based investment firm would want to meet at a private home instead of a law office. Luther confirmed that already ordered cases of champagne and hired caterers, planning another private celebration for after the signing. They were going to toast to their success, to getting away with murder and stealing billions, and they were going to do it right before I walked through the door and tore their world apart. Saturday evening at 7 o'clock, I'd scheduled their apocalypse, and everything was ready. Saturday arrived with unseasonably cold weather, the kind of chill that settles into California a few times each winter and makes everyone act like it's a blizzard. I drove to the estate in a rental car, my hands steady on the wheel despite my heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest. 3 months since they'd murdered me, 90 days of planning and patience, and now the moment had finally arrived. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the final distance, my black suit perfect armor against the cold and my purpose. The estate looked exactly as I remembered from childhood, massive and modern with floor-to-ceiling windows that I'd always thought made it look like a fishbowl. I'd grown up in that house, learned to swim in that pool, had my high school graduation party on that lawn, and now I was returning as an avenging ghost to destroy everyone inside. I entered through the kitchen door at 6 o'clock, a full hour before the scheduled meeting, using a key from my childhood that they'd never bothered to change because the arrogant always assume their victories are permanent. The house smelled like expensive catering and fresh flowers, and I could hear them upstairs preparing, their voices floating down through the open architecture. Vivian was barking orders at staff about wine temperature and glass placement. Garrett was on his phone, bragging to someone about the deal he'd negotiated, taking full credit for an acquisition that didn't actually exist. Sloane's distinctive laugh echoed from somewhere, that cruel sound that had always made my skin crawl. My father's cough came from his study, wet and rattling, the sound of a man drinking himself to death. I moved through my childhood home like the ghost I was supposed to be, placing recording devices in the living room because I wanted to capture every moment of what was about to happen. By 6:30, they'd assembled in the formal living room, dressed in their finest clothes and wearing their biggest smiles. They'd set up a bar with the expensive champagne, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier. Everything arranged for a celebration. Garrett raised his glass and said, "Tonight we officially become billionaires on paper," Everything we've worked for, finally real. Sloane clinked her glass against his. "I'm buying the Hamptons house tomorrow. Already talked to the realtor." Vivian stood between her children, looking triumphant. "To our brilliant plan, flawlessly executed. To family. They toasted to my death. To their success in murdering me and stealing everything." My father sat in the corner chair with his own glass, but he didn't drink, just stared into the amber liquid like he could see my face floating in the scotch. Whatever guilt he felt wasn't enough to stop him from being here, from participating in their celebration, and that killed any remaining sympathy I might have had. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang with perfect timing. Garrett went to answer, his walk confident and eager, expecting Arcturus representatives with contracts to sign. He pulled open the heavy front door, and I stepped out of the shadows into the porch light, very much alive, very much furious. For 3 perfect seconds, Garrett just stared at me, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. Then understanding hit and all color drained from his face. His whiskey glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor, expensive liquor spreading in a puddle around his feet. "No," he whispered, then louder, "No. You're dead. We watched you drown." I smiled at him, cold as the ocean that had tried to kill me, and said, "Clearly, big brother, you didn't watch carefully enough." I stepped over the threshold into my childhood home, and Garrett stumbled backward like I might reach out and drag him to hell. The sound of breaking glass brought Sloane running from the living room, and when she saw me standing in the foyer, her scream echoed off the high ceilings. She actually screamed like she'd encountered a demon, her hands flying to her mouth and her eyes going wide with pure terror. Vivian appeared behind her, and I watched her face cycle through shock, fear, and then rage in rapid succession. "This is impossible," she hissed, her mask of sophisticated control slipping completely. "You died. You died." I met her eyes without flinching and replied, "Sorry to disappoint you, Vivian. Turns out I'm harder to kill than you calculated." The last person to appear was my father, emerging from his study with unsteady steps, and when he saw me standing in the foyer, he grabbed the doorframe for support. All color drained from his already pale face, and he whispered, "Mallory. Oh God, Mallory. You're alive." His voice carried genuine shock and what might have been relief, but also unmistakable fear. I walked past all of them into the living room, taking my time, letting them follow like children being called to the principal's office. I sat in my father's favorite chair, the power seat that faced the room, reversing decades of family dynamics with one gesture. They stood uncertain, their carefully planned celebration destroyed, their confidence shattered by the presence of a woman who should be 3 months dead. Garrett found his voice first. "How did you survive? The water, the cold? You should have." He trailed off, apparently realizing that finishing that sentence meant admitting Head tried to murder me. I leaned back in the chair and crossed my legs, projecting calm I didn't entirely feel. "I'm a good swimmer, Garrett. Better than you calculated when you and Sloane threw me off that yacht." Sloane, always the stupid one, asked the question that proved she didn't understand the situation yet. "Why are you here?" I actually laughed, bitter and harsh. "Why? You tried to murder me. Stole my inheritance, destroyed my company, turned my father into your accomplice, and you're asking why I'm here." Vivian had recovered some of her composure, her lawyer's mind searching for angles. "You can't prove anything. It was dark, you were drunk, accidents happen at sea." I pulled out a tablet I'd been carrying and held it up so they could all see the screen. "Can't I prove it?" I pressed play, and their own voices filled the room. Audio from their celebration dinner 2 days after my supposed death. Garrett slurring about how they should have killed me sooner. Sloane admitting she'd almost felt bad. Vivian calling me weak, like my pathetic mother. I watched their faces as they heard themselves, watched the moment they realized I had evidence. But the audio was just the beginning. I pulled up a video montage I'd compiled, starting with testimony from the yacht crew that Luther had tracked down in Mexico. They'd taken Vivian's bribe, but their consciences had eventually won, and they'd been willing to talk once offered immunity. Then bank records showing the $200,000 bribery payment. Email chains planning my murder in explicit detail, discussing methods and timing and how to make it look accidental. Financial fraud evidence showing Garrett's illegal deals. tax evasion documentation for Sloane's offshore accounts, insurance fraud from the claims they'd filed on my death. Everything, presented in clear chronological order, undeniable and damning. They watched themselves being destroyed in high definition, and I savored every moment of their growing horror. Sloane cracked first, always the weak link. She started crying hysterically, words tumbling out between sobs. It wasn't my idea, I swear. They made me do it. I didn't want to, but Mom said we had no choice. Garrett immediately turned on his mother. You said it was foolproof. You said there was no way she could survive or prove anything. Vivian's control was slipping, but she tried to maintain authority. This doesn't matter. Evidence obtained illegally is inadmissible, and we can explain all of this with the right lawyers. I let her finish, then smiled. Explain it to who? The FBI, because they're actually very interested in meeting all of you. My father finally spoke, his voice breaking. You called the FBI? Mallory. I know what we did was wrong, but we're still family. I looked at him. 3 months of hurt and betrayal concentrated into one glance. What did you expect, Dad? A family reunion where we hug and forgive and pretend you didn't watch them throw me into the ocean? You did nothing. You stood there and apologized like that made it okay. Then you let them take everything while you drank yourself into oblivion. You're not my family. You're my father's ghost wearing his face. That's when my father collapsed into a chair, aging 10 years in 10 seconds. The weight of what had done seemed to finally register as he saw me alive, saw the evidence of their crimes, understood that consequences were coming. I'm sorry, he whispered, tears starting to stream down his face. God, Mallory, I'm so sorry. I was weak. Vivian convinced me you weren't ready for the responsibility, that the company needed mature leadership, that this was the right thing for everyone. I don't know what I was thinking. I leaned forward, my voice cold enough to freeze. You were thinking about yourself, about taking the easy way out, about the woman who replaced Mom in your bed and in your mind. You chose comfort over your daughter, and now you get to live with that choice from a prison cell. Vivian hissed at me, her composure completely shattered now. Don't you dare talk about your father like that. You don't understand the pressure he was under, the decisions he had to make. I stood up and walked to the window, timing perfect as FBI vehicles pulled up outside, their lights painting the driveway in red and blue. Shut up, Vivian. You don't get to talk anymore. Your time is done. I turned back to face them, gesturing toward the approaching law enforcement. I told you I brought a gift. Justice. Wrapped in a bow. You're all going to prison, and I'm going to rebuild everything you tried to destroy. Agents entered the house through the front door that Garrett had left standing open. Professional and efficient, reading rights while pulling out handcuffs. Garrett tried to run, actually bolted for the back door like he was in some action movie, and 2 agents tackled him in the hallway. Sloane fell to her knees begging, offering money, promising anything, completely humiliating herself while agents cuffed her wrists. Vivian went silent, her lawyer instincts taking over, refusing to say anything without representation. My father just surrendered, holding out his wrists for the cuffs like a man who'd been expecting this moment. The lead agent approached me with professional respect. Miss Collins, excellent work. Your cooperation made this case airtight. I'd been working with the FBI for 6 weeks, granted immunity in exchange for testimony and evidence, and I'd delivered them the easiest prosecution of their careers. As agents led them out one by one, Vivian passed close enough for me to whisper to her. She leaned in despite the handcuffs, probably expecting threats or curses, and I gave her something worse. You think you'll fight this? Get good lawyers and beat the charges? Check your bank accounts. Her eyes widened with sudden understanding. I'd used my encryption backdoors that morning to freeze every account she controlled, every offshore trust, every shell corporation. They had nothing left to hire lawyers, nothing to mount a defense, nothing but public defenders and overwhelming evidence. Checkmate had never tasted sweeter, and I watched her face collapse into despair as she understood how completely I'd destroyed them. The FBI separated them immediately upon arrival at the federal building, standard procedure for co-conspirators. Garrett cracked within 2 hours, his expensive business school education apparently not covering what to do when caught for murder. He gave up everything, blamed Vivian for orchestrating the whole plan, claimed had just been following orders and was too afraid of his mother to refuse. The interrogation recording that the prosecutor shared with me was pathetic. Watching this man Hod strutted around my company like he owned it, reduced to sobbing and begging for leniency. Sloane lasted slightly longer, but not much. Her hysterical confession confirming every detail we already knew. She painted herself as Vivian's victim, manipulated since childhood, but the jury would later find that excuse unconvincing. Given the Instagram posts where Shed celebrated my death, Vivian remained silent and demanded a lawyer, but her attorney never came, because Id intercepted the call and redirected it, leaving her sitting in an interrogation room for 8 hours before she finally understood no help was coming. My father asked only one question during his entire interrogation: "Is Mallory safe?" The agent's response was cold: "No thanks to you." News of their arrests broke within hours and immediately became the biggest business crime story of the decade. Every network carried it with breathless commentary, and social media exploded with speculation and hot takes. Tech heiress alive, family arrested for attempted murder, scrolled across every channel while anchors struggled to process the story's soap opera elements. The combination of extreme wealth, family betrayal, attempted murder, and my dramatic resurrection from the dead created the perfect media storm. Cable news ran 24-hour coverage, dissecting every angle, interviewing former employees and distant relatives and random Silicon Valley personalities who wanted their moment in the spotlight. My face was everywhere, before and after photos comparing the naive daughter who'd disappeared to the sharp-edged woman who'd returned seeking justice. I ignored all interview requests, letting the evidence speak for itself. The company held an emergency board meeting at midnight on the day of the arrests, every member attending via video or in person despite the late hour. I joined via encrypted video feed, still legally dead until paperwork could be processed, and played recordings of Garrett's deals that had nearly given away company secrets to Chinese competitors. I showed evidence of Sloane's wasteful spending that had drained operational accounts. I presented documentation of Vivian's manipulation and control over my father's decision-making. The board voted unanimously to immediately remove all three from any position of authority, terminating their employment for cause without severance or stock options. My father's shares were frozen pending investigation into his role, and the board appointed Luther as emergency CEO until the situation stabilized. It was the fastest, most decisive board action in company history, and I felt grim satisfaction watching the empire it built reject the people who'd tried to steal it. I met Luther privately the day after the arrests at a secure location, needing to thank the man who'd risked everything to help me. "Why did you do it?" I asked him. "You've been with my father for 30 years. You could have just stayed quiet and kept your job." Luther looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Your mother was my best friend before she married your father. We worked together at a startup that failed, and she was the most brilliant person I ever knew. When she died, I promised her memory that if anything ever happened, I'd watch over you. I'm sorry I couldn't stop them sooner. I should have seen what Vivian was doing." That revelation broke something in me, and for the first time since being pulled from the Pacific, I broke down crying. Someone had actually cared all along, had been watching and protecting me in ways I never knew. We sat together in that anonymous office while I sobbed out 3 months of trauma and grief, and Luther held my hand like the family it always needed. My first public appearance came 5 days after the arrests at a hastily arranged press conference. Hundreds of cameras filled the room, reporters standing shoulder to shoulder for a chance to ask questions. I'd prepared a careful statement with the prosecutor's office, but when I stood at that podium looking at all those faces, I went completely off script. 3 months ago, I said, my voice steady despite shaking hands. My family tried to kill me for money. Not strangers, not enemies. The people who raised me, who I trusted, who I loved. The man who was supposed to protect me watched them throw me off a yacht and did nothing. My voice broke, and I had to pause, compose myself, find the strength to continue. But I'm still here, and I want other people trapped in toxic families to know that you can survive this. You can rebuild. You don't owe loyalty to people who betray you. Blood doesn't justify abuse, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. Or in my case, swim away and come back for justice. The press corps gave me a standing ovation, something I'd never heard of happening at a press conference. and I realized my story had become bigger than just me. It'd become a symbol of survival. The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed because the evidence was so overwhelming. A grand jury indicted all four within a week on multiple charges: conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, securities fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, bribery, and insurance fraud. Combined, they faced over 50 counts each, with potential sentences ranging from decades to life in prison. The prosecutor called it one of the most clear-cut cases she'd ever seen, with evidence so thoroughly documented that no reasonable jury could find doubt. Defense attorneys tried various strategies to get charges reduced or dismissed, but every attempt failed because it'd been so meticulous in my documentation. They'd destroyed themselves with their own arrogance, and now they'd pay the price. Garrett's lawyer approached prosecutors with a plea deal, offering to testify against Vivian in exchange for a reduced sentence of 15 years instead of life. The prosecutor needed my approval as the primary victim, and I refused without hesitation. He held my arms while they threw me off that yacht, I told her. He celebrated my death. He tried to destroy my company. He deserves everything that's coming, and I won't help him escape consequences. Garrett got no deal and would face trial with the others. Sloane's case took a different turn when psychiatric evaluation revealed genuine mental instability from years of drug abuse and possible mental illness that had gone untreated. Instead of prison, she'd be remanded to a secure psychiatric facility for a minimum of 20 years. Part of me felt this was too lenient, but I remembered the audio of her saying she'd almost felt bad, and I chose to believe some tiny part of her had been reachable before Vivian poisoned it completely. Vivian chose to go to trial instead of pleading guilty, which her lawyer later admitted was the biggest mistake they could have made. The prosecution presented 3 weeks of devastating evidence, playing audio and video recordings, calling witnesses, walking the jury through every step of the conspiracy. I testified for 2 full days, telling the jury about growing up in that family, about the betrayal, about treading water in the freezing Pacific while my father watched from the yacht. Vivian's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive and manipulative, suggesting I'd manufactured evidence, but the jury saw through it immediately. They deliberated for 90 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all 43 counts. The judge's words at sentencing were scathing. In 30 years on the bench, I've never witnessed such calculated cruelty. You manipulated a dying man, turned his children against each other, orchestrated an attempted murder for pure greed, and showed no remorse whatsoever. You represent the worst impulses of humanity. Vivian received 40 years to life with no possibility of parole for 30 years, which, at her age, meant she'd die in prison. My father's case was the most complicated because he'd participated but showed genuine remorse, and his lawyers presented evidence that Vivian had systematically isolated and manipulated him. Doctors testified about his heart condition, making him vulnerable to coercive control, about medications that affected his judgment, about the psychological impact of grief over losing my mother, making him susceptible to Vivian's influence. The prosecution acknowledged these factors but maintained that Head still conspired to commit murder and had to face consequences. They recommended 20 years instead of life, and the judge scheduled a sentencing hearing where victims could speak. I spent a week deciding what to say, rehearsing in front of my mirror, trying to find words adequate for the betrayal. The courtroom was silent when I approached the podium for my victim impact statement. My father sat in an orange jumpsuit looking 20 years older than his actual age, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. I looked directly at him and said, "You were my hero growing up, the man who taught me to code, who told me I could change the world, who promised you'd always protect me. Mom loved you so much, believed in you when no one else did, and you let Vivian poison everything she built. You watched them throw me into the ocean, and you did nothing except apologize like that, made it okay." He was openly sobbing by then, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his guilt. But Mom also taught me about mercy and second chances. She believed everyone deserved the opportunity for redemption. So I'm not asking for the maximum sentence. I'm asking for justice, for consequences, and for you to spend whatever time you have left thinking about what you destroyed and who you could have been. The judge sentenced him to 15 years with possibility of compassionate release if his heart condition became terminal. He'd likely die in prison either way, but maybe he'd find some peace before the end. I left the courthouse that day feeling hollow rather than triumphant. Justice had been served. My family was facing consequences for their crimes, but none of it brought back the naive woman who'd believed in them. That version of me had drowned in the Pacific, and the woman who survived was harder, colder, less willing to trust. It won, but the victory tasted like ashes, because winning meant accepting that the people I'd loved most had tried to kill me for money. Some scars heal, but others just become part of who you are, and I carried those scars into every interaction and relationship that followed. 6 months after the arrests, I stood in the company headquarters boardroom as the legally alive and officially appointed CEO of my father's empire. The death certificate had been nullified through court order, my identity fully restored, and the trust inheritance secured under my control. All $6.5 billion, every asset, every stock option, everything they'd tried to steal through murder, now belonged exclusively to me. Their own assets had been seized for restitution, every penny going back to repair the damage Garrett had done during his brief destructive reign. They'd gotten nothing from their conspiracy except prison sentences and destroyed lives, while I stood at the pinnacle of success with an empire to rebuild. Luther and I worked 18-hour days for the first 3 months, repairing damage and rebuilding trust. I fired everyone Garrett had hired. His incompetent friends Hode spent more time playing office politics than actually working, and I brought back the talented employees who'd been forced out. Within 3 months, the company had stabilized, stock prices recovering as investors regained confidence in the leadership. Within 6 months, we exceeded our previous valuation as I rolled out new innovations and secured major contracts. Garrett's incompetence had nearly destroyed. My encryption algorithm was secured with new protocols, and we filed dozens of new patents on technology I'd been developing. The company that had nearly died under their mismanagement was thriving again, proving that leadership actually mattered. I fundamentally changed the corporate culture, determined that no one else would ever face the desperation that leads to family betrayal. I created an employee profit-sharing program that distributed wealth throughout the organization, saying publicly that no single person should have the kind of power that corrupts absolutely. Mental health benefits were expanded to include unlimited therapy sessions and mental wellness days. Whistleblower protections were strengthened with significant financial incentives for reporting unethical behavior. An ethics committee with real enforcement power was established, answerable directly to the board rather than executive leadership. Industry publications called us a model for responsible technology companies, and recruiting became easier as top talent wanted to work somewhere that valued people over pure profit. Personally, I struggled with rebuilding my life outside work. I bought a new house on the coast, modern and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I could see the water every day, a constant reminder that I'd survived when they'd tried to drown me. The view was both healing and haunting, and I started each morning with coffee on my balcony, watching waves and processing trauma. Therapy became a weekly commitment as I dealt with PTSD from the drowning, trust issues that made relationships nearly impossible, and complicated grief over my father's betrayal. My therapist helped me understand that healing wasn't linear, that some days I'd feel strong and other days I'd break down crying over nothing, and both were valid responses to trauma. Luther became more than a colleague, transforming into the father figure I desperately needed. He'd been my mother's best friend, and he shared stories about her that I'd never heard, filling in gaps about who she'd been before becoming my father's wife. She was fierce like you, he told me one evening over dinner, brilliant and determined, never backing down from a challenge. She'd be so proud of who you've become, how you survived and rebuilt. We established a weekly dinner tradition, just the two of us, slowly healing the family wounds that my biological family had created. He noticed when I kept everyone else at emotional distance, building walls to protect myself from future betrayal. You've built security walls taller than your company's firewall, he observed gently. Walls keep you safe, but they also keep you alone, and your mother wouldn't want you to live like that. Rebuilding personal relationships was the hardest part of recovery. Trusting anyone felt impossible after such profound betrayal, and I found myself constantly analyzing people's motives and looking for hidden agendas. I started small, having coffee with former colleagues, reconnecting with college friends I'd lost touch with, and slowly admitting what had happened to me. Most people were supportive and understanding, though some looked at me like I was damaged goods, a victim marked by trauma they didn't want to catch. I learned to identify genuine friends versus people attracted to my wealth and notoriety, a skill I'd never needed before but was essential now. A documentary producer approached me about telling my story, and my first instinct was to refuse because reliving the trauma for cameras seemed impossible. But then I remembered my press conference, my words about helping other people trapped in toxic families, and I realized this could be bigger than just me. I agreed with strict conditions, complete honesty, no dramatization, focus on recovery rather than sensationalism, and editorial approval over the final cut. Drowned. A heiress resurrection was released 1 year after my arrest and won an Emmy for Outstanding Documentary. More importantly, it inspired thousands of abuse survivors to leave toxic situations, to seek help, to understand they weren't alone. My inbox flooded with messages from people thanking me for giving them courage to escape their own families, and that impact meant more than any business success possibly could. 1 year into her sentence, Vivian filed an appeal, claiming the evidence had been obtained illegally. Her lawyers argued that my encryption backdoor violated privacy laws, that accessing company systems without administrative authorization meant all evidence should be suppressed. The federal judge reviewed the claim thoroughly, and I testified about why ID built the backdoor in the first place. It was a security measure against corporate espionage, I explained, showing documentation from my original patent applications that clearly described the backdoor's existence and purpose. Completely legal, completely documented, and completely within my rights as the algorithm's creator and the company's primary security architect. The judge agreed, denied the appeal, and Vivian's last hope of freedom died. She sent a letter from prison that began, "This isn't over," but I burned it without reading beyond the first line. She had nothing left to threaten me with, and her words held no power anymore. Garrett gave a prison interview to some opportunistic journalist, trying to rehabilitate his image by claiming he'd been Vivian's victim too. "She manipulated all of us," he said, trying to look sympathetic. "I was just as trapped as Mallory, just in a different way." The public wasn't buying it because footage had leaked of him at the celebration dinner laughing about my death, saying they should have done it years ago. Those words haunted him, playing on news programs and social media whenever his name came up. His parole board would see that footage eventually, and I doubted he'd ever convince them he deserved early release. Sloan sent me a letter from her treatment facility 6 months into her incarceration, and I almost threw it away unread. But something made me open it, maybe curiosity, or maybe the fact that she was the only one who'd shown even a hint of conscience before. The letter was long and rambling, but ultimately honest. She detailed how Vivian had manipulated her since childhood, pitting her against me, feeding her drugs to keep her compliant, convincing her that I was the enemy rather than her sister. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she wrote, "but I need you to know that I'm sorry. Every single day, I'm sorry. The medications help me see clearly now, and what I see is a monster I let myself become. I don't expect you to ever speak to me again, but please know that I understand what I did and am trying to become someone better." I didn't respond to the letter, but I also didn't throw it away. I kept it in my desk drawer, a reminder that maybe, possibly, someday there could be redemption for at least one of them. My father's health deteriorated rapidly in prison. His heart condition worsened without access to proper care and with the stress of incarceration, and prison doctors reported he had months rather than years remaining. His lawyer filed for compassionate release, which required my approval as the victim. I spent 2 weeks wrestling with the decision, torn between the part of me that wanted him to suffer and the part that was still his little girl. My therapist helped me understand that this decision was about my peace, not about him, about what would let me move forward rather than stay trapped in bitterness. I approved the compassionate release on the condition that he be moved to a secure medical hospice facility, and I visited him once before he died. He looked ancient, his skin gray and his breathing labored, and when he saw me, he started crying. "Thank you for coming," he whispered. "I didn't think you would." I sat in the chair beside his bed but didn't touch him, needing physical distance even in this final moment. I didn't come for you, I said honestly. I came for me, for closure. He nodded, understanding, and told me everything. About how Vivian had systematically poisoned his mind against me, isolated him from friends who might have questioned her, controlled his medications to keep him foggy and compliant. "I'm not making excuses," he said between labored breaths. "I was weak. I chose her comfort over your safety. I'll die knowing I'm a monster." I looked at this broken man and said, "You're not a monster. Monsters don't feel regret. You're just a weak man who made terrible choices, and I'm choosing to forgive you. Not for you, but for me, so I can move on without this weight." He died 2 days later, and I didn't cry until a week after the funeral when the finality hit me all at once. The company reached a major milestone 1 year after I took control, hitting a $10 billion valuation and effectively doubling in value since ID reclaimed leadership. Industry publications crowned me the Phoenix CEO, and Forbes featured me on their cover with the headline, "The Woman Who Drowned and Rose a Billionaire." The success felt hollow without family to share it with, but Luther reminded me that I was building a new kind of family. Employees who genuinely cared, friends who supported me, chosen relationships that meant more than blood ever had. It wasn't traditional, but it was real, and it was mine. 2 years after they threw me off that yacht, I stood on my balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean with my morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink. The same ocean that had nearly killed me no longer filled me with fear, but with a strange sense of gratitude. I'd reclaimed it, learned to sail again on my own terms. Bought a small yacht I'd named Phoenix Rising because symbolism mattered. The water had tried to take me and failed, and now it was just water again, beautiful and neutral, no longer an enemy. It used a significant portion of my wealth to create the Second Chances Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping survivors of family abuse escape toxic situations. We provided financial assistance to leave dangerous homes, legal support for restraining orders and custody battles, therapy funding, job placement services, and housing assistance. In our first year, WED helped 3,000 people rebuild their lives, and that work became my real legacy. More important than any technology ID ever developed, every person we helped felt like another small victory against the darkness that had tried to consume me. Romance came unexpectedly through foundation work when I met Marcus, a volunteer attorney who donated his time to help abuse survivors navigate the legal system. Had survived his own abusive family and understood my walls without needing explanation. We spent 6 months as friends before our first date, building trust slowly and carefully, both of us too damaged to rush into anything. He didn't push or demand, just waited patiently while I learned to trust again. 2 years later, we were building something real, something based on honesty and mutual respect rather than the twisted dynamics I'd grown up thinking were normal. Luther's retirement party filled the company headquarters with 500 employees who came to celebrate a man who'd given 35 years to the company. I gave a speech that had most people crying. This man saved my life in more ways than one. He was loyal when loyalty was dangerous. He was family when family betrayed me. And he gave me something I desperately needed, someone who believed in me without conditions or hidden agendas. Luther, you gave me the greatest gift possible, and I hope I've made you proud. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, and when I hugged him afterward, he whispered, "Your mother would be so proud of who you've become, of how you survived and built something beautiful from ashes." On the 2-year anniversary of my supposed death, a letter arrived at my office on prison stationery, Vivian's handwriting, shakier now than before. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won and I broke the seal. The letter was surprisingly honest, perhaps because she had nothing left to lose. "You won," she wrote. "I'm dying here, cancer eating through me with maybe 6 months left. I won't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it and you wouldn't grant it anyway. But I need you to know that I never understood you. You had everything and you earned it, and that terrified me because my whole life was about taking from others. You built things. I destroyed things. And in the end, you were always going to win, because builders create legacies, while destroyers just leave ruins. I'm dying in a cage I built for myself, and you're free." I filed the letter away and felt absolutely nothing, Not satisfaction or pity or vindication. Just done. Completely and utterly done with all of them. Garrett's transformation shocked everyone, including me. 10 years into his sentence, prison reports indicated Head become a model prisoner who taught coding classes to other inmates. His rehabilitation was genuine enough that parole boards were discussing early release in 5 years. I surprised myself by hoping he got it. Not because I'd forgiven him, but because I wanted him to be better, to spend the rest of his life making amends so no other family would suffer what mine had. That didn't mean I'd ever speak to him again, but I could hope for his redemption from a safe distance. 20 months into treatment, Sloane's therapists reported major progress. She was fully clean from drugs, medicated appropriately for her mental health conditions, and taking real responsibility for her actions. She asked through her doctors if I'd ever consider visiting, and I spent weeks deciding. My therapist asked what I wanted from a meeting, and I realized I wanted to see if there was anything real under all that damage, if the sister I'd hoped for had ever existed. I agreed to one visit with no promises beyond that. The facility visiting room was sterile and uncomfortable, but Sloane looked completely different from the woman who'd helped throw me overboard. Her eyes were clear, her manner tentative but genuine, and when she said, "You came, I didn't think you would," I heard real surprise and gratitude. We talked for 2 hours about everything that had happened, and she took full responsibility without excuses. She explained her childhood with Vivian in detail I'd never known, the abuse and manipulation and gaslighting that had shaped her into someone cruel. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said carefully. "I don't deserve that, but I want you to know that the sister who laughed about your death wasn't really me. It was the puppet Vivian created. I'm trying to find the real me underneath all that damage, trying to become someone worthy of the second chance I don't deserve." I told her to keep trying, that growth was all any of us could do, and I left without promises, but with a tiny seed of possibility that someday we might have some kind of relationship. 5 years after I took back control, the company hit a $15 billion valuation and became one of the fastest-growing technology firms in the world. But it made it different, obtaining B Corporation certification that legally required us to balance profit with social responsibility. We became carbon neutral, implemented employee ownership programs, and committed to distributing wealth throughout the organization. It decided that no one person should have the kind of wealth and power I controlled, that it was too much and it corrupted, so it built systems to prevent future consolidation. Silicon Valley thought I was crazy, but employees loved working for a company that valued them as people rather than resources. On the 3rd anniversary of my supposed death, I took the Phoenix Rising out with Luther, Marcus, and a few close friends. We sailed to the approximate spot where I'd nearly drowned, and everyone fell silent, understanding the gravity of returning to the place of my trauma. I stood at the rail looking into the dark water, remembering that night with perfect clarity. The cold, the betrayal, the fight to survive, all of it as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. I spoke to the ocean like it could hear me. "You tried to take me, they tried to take me. But I'm still here, stronger than before, and I'm not afraid anymore." I dropped roses into the water, one for every person I'd lost that night, including the naive version of myself who'd believed family was everything. Then I turned to my chosen family, the people who'd helped me rebuild, and smiled genuinely for the first time in years. "Let's go home." That evening, I sat alone in my office with a photograph of my mother, the only family member who'd never betrayed me. "I survived, Mom," I told her picture. "Not just the water, but all of it. The betrayal, the pain, the rebuilding. I wish you were here to see what I've built, but I think somehow you are, watching and proud." I thought about everything I'd lost. My father, the fantasy of family, the innocence that let me trust easily. But I also thought about what I'd gained. Strength, wisdom, genuine relationships, purpose, the ability to help others survive their own families. The equation balanced differently than I'd expected, but it did balance in a way that felt meaningful. An unexpected package appeared on my desk one afternoon with no return address. Inside was a child's drawing done in prison, art therapy. Clearly Garrett's work. The picture showed a little boy teaching a little girl how to use a computer, a memory from our childhood before Vivian had entered our lives and poisoned everything. On the back had written, "I remember who I was before she destroyed us. I'm trying to find him again." Thank you for surviving. You deserved so much better than what we became. I placed it in my desk drawer, next to Sloane's letter, a small collection of redemptions that might someday grow into something resembling forgiveness. Someone asked me at a speaking engagement what gift it brought my family that night I returned from the dead, referencing the title that had spread through media coverage. I smiled, sharp and satisfied, and said, I brought them the truth that actions have consequences, that you can't murder someone and steal their life without paying a price, that the underestimated and betrayed and drowned don't stay down. We come back stronger, smarter, and we win. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. But the real gift wasn't for them. The gift was for me. I gave myself freedom from their toxicity, from fear, from the need for their approval and love. That's the greatest gift anyone can receive. The freedom to be yourself without apology or shame. The final image of my journey shows me at my desk as the sun sets over the Pacific, my company thriving in the floors below, my foundation changing lives across the country, my chosen family supporting me, and my scars healed enough to move forward. I don't look backward at what was lost, but forward at what I'm building, at the future I'm creating on my own terms. I've learned that surviving isn't the same as living. And I've chosen to really live rather than just exist in the shadow of trauma. Some days are harder than others. Some mornings I wake up angry at what they took from me. But most days I wake up grateful for what I've built from the ruins they left behind. They tried to drown me to steal $6.5 billion. But in the end, I stole something far more valuable from them. I stole their victory, their peace of mind, their freedom, and their legacy. Most importantly, I stole back my own life and rebuilt it into something they could never understand or destroy. I did it all by simply refusing to die, by swimming when I should have sunk, by rising when I should have stayed down, by becoming the ghost that haunted them until justice arrived. And now, 2 years later, I stand as proof that the drowned can rise, that betrayal can be survived, that families don't define us unless we let them, and that sometimes the best revenge is building a life so beautiful it makes your enemy's defeat look like the tragedy it truly is. So now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members for your own survival? How did you find the strength to walk away from people who were supposed to love you? Drop your stories in the comments because we're building a community of survivors here, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more true stories about survival and resilience, and share this with anyone who needs to know that drowning isn't the end, it's just the beginning of rising again. Thank you for listening to my story, for being part of this journey, and for understanding that sometimes the family we choose means more than the family we're born into. Stay strong, stay safe, and remember that you deserve people who celebrate your success rather than plotting your destruction. Until next time, keep swimming.